All right, guys, this is the final of two uh, presentations over Unit 4. Should be significantly shorter than the last section. However, a lot of important stuff here as we look at basically the practices, the theories, the ideas from the first unit of Unit 4 and now putting into practice of how things really work in the real world. So, again, the first section more theoretical, concept based, and now this is actually what happens in the political world when we put these ideas together. All right, so just to review the big ideas for Unit 4, how do historical and current events influence political structures around the world? How are balances of power reflected in political boundaries and government power structures? And how can political, economic, cultural, and or technological changes challenge state sovereignty or power? So, how do things that are happening around us impact the political structures of how politics and governments work? How do countries working together, the balances of power, impact not only how governments work, but also the boundaries and borders of which we work with? And then how can political, economic, cultural, and technological changes challenge state sovereignty or power? So let's rock and roll. All right, so first section here, 4.8, defining devolutionary factors. So we're going to define the factors that leads to the devolution of states. You got a lot of things there, but the first thing we want to know is what is devolution? Last year, one of the FRQs was about devolution, so I would be a little surprised if they ask you another one that directly goes against or goes for this. However, there could very well be a task, the ABCDE, there could be a task in there that says to define it or explain it a little bit. So certainly something that's important. Devolution happens when you transfer political power from the central government to subnational levels. So when we say subnational, we mean below national. So that can mean state government, that could be local government, regional government, depending on what country you're in and what they call it. But in this case, you're basically saying, okay, here's a power that our national or federal government did, and now that power is being spread amongst everyone to the states. So, for an example, our national government is the only government in our country that can declare war. But let's say that power devolves to the states. So now that the states can declare war on each other, this is a process of devolution in which the power is shifting from the national to the state or to the local. Now, if that happens continually and we have kind of an acceleration of devolution that happens, you may get enough powers moving to those subnational governments that it leads to new political units starting. So let's say all of these powers get to our state governments, we may get states declaring independence and becoming something new. So that process is called balkanization. But again, the bigger story here is devolution, which is basically your puzzle that is together, but now it starts to break apart because of different powers that once were held by the national government or the federal government are now moving across to state and local governments. So our big question here is establishing why does this happen? So the first thing I think is when we just look at a map. If we have a physical distance between part of a country and the rest of the country, that can very much cause isolation and increase the likelihood of devolution. So let's talk about, you see here in this picture, Kashmir, which is a region of India and Pakistan. It is not reasonably close to the Indian capital. And in Pakistan, which is a very mountainous country, it is certainly an area that is a little bit farther removed. So that leads China to be able to perhaps have some influence there, and it leads the people of Kashmir to seek some sort of independence. I think a better example here is just think about Hawaii and Alaska. Hawaii and Alaska are so removed from the United States that in theory, there may be movements to say, this definitely is the case in Hawaii, to say, hey, we are culturally very different from the rest of the country. We are geographically removed from the rest of the country. Perhaps we need to push for our own political independence by establishing ourselves as a legitimate alternative of a governmental body or a leading government body. So instead of people of Hawaii, the top of their government being in Washington, D.C., half a world away, now they want their state government in Honolulu to have a lot more power. So again, physical geography, I think, is one of the more predominant reasons why a region would say, hey, we're removed from the rest of this country. Let's go ahead and try to push for our independence and perhaps pick off some powers through devolution before doing that. Another issue that can lead to devolution is ethnic separatism. So if you have a part of the country that is a distinct ethnicity, now this can uh, mirror itself with physical geography, and when you have that, it's even more prevalent. But if you have an ethnic group that's clustered in a region, that ethnic group culturally may say, listen, we know how to run our show better than our national capital. So we talked about this with like the federal government or the federal state, right? This is kind of when you want that federal state because you have a local government that can do things, but that may not be enough for that ethnicity. Maybe they desire independence and it's a nationality that they want to push for their own. So we see that in Spain quite a bit. The Basque and the Catalans are two ethnicities that in many ways desire, especially in Catalonia, they desire their own independence. So the factor that may lead to devolution here, again, that power being shifted from Madrid to those more local areas, in Spain's case, the devolution factor is that ethnic difference and that desire to potentially separate from the rest of the country. One thing that we didn't talk about in class but can be an issue is terrorism, in which potentially you have a violent movement that occurs that is trying to split the country into two or perhaps devolve the country's power to more regional areas. That is not too common, but you do see these political terrorists. I think we think certainly with terrorism, unfortunately, more of a religious sense. Certainly, growing up in the age of 9/11, I think that's something that we are more predominant to see. But you have the IRA in Ireland. There's certainly other political groups, the Basque ETA, who are motivated for political reasons and resort to terrorism to be able to do that. So I would put this one kind of at a different level than physical geography and ethnic separatism as means for devolution, but I think it's still something that you should consider. I think this one's up there in that top tier. When we think about economic factors, we're thinking about a part of a country that usually is maybe more successful than the rest and might desire to gain more powers for its state or local government as a means of saying you're welcome for all the economic benefit that they bring. So either controlled natural resources, using that as kind of a bargaining chip to say, listen, we should be able to do X, Y, and Z in our state areas because here's what we do for the country. So in Scotland, you've got a lot of factors going on as Scotland seeks to move from the United Kingdom and declare its independence. They had a referendum vote in 2014, I believe, to see if Scotland would break. That narrowly failed. I would anticipate within the next 10 years that will happen again, and I will not be surprised if that break does happen. Partly because Scotland's economy is not bad. The reserves from the North Sea oil give them an economic bargaining chip, if you will, with London and the United Kingdom to say, hey, listen, we're doing all this. Perhaps we need more power and our own independence because the UK is a unitary government. It's not federal, so there's not a Scottish government, to my knowledge. I mean, don't quote me on that. but there's not an independent Scottish government, independent of Parliament and the United Kingdom. I think. Again, don't call me an expert. I'm just teaching AP Human Geography. What do you want from me? Last but not least, we look at social factors as reasons that countries may want to split. And when we talk social factors, we're bringing in culture, religion, language, historical connections. You might feel some sort of difference because of your culture is different. So this kind of plays into ethnic separatism a little bit. Again, we talked about how the federal system kind of allows for this to happen. But devolution, certainly for a unitary government, may occur as it kind of transforms into a federal government. In Belgium, you've got the north part of the country and the south part of the country, very much of a linguistic difference. And that has led to differences inside of Belgium in the quest maybe to grant devolutionary powers to smaller governments in the north of the country. So, again, really when we think about devolution, it could be a lot of different things that leads to it. Social factors, the economics, the physical geography, the ethnic separatism, which kind of is a carryover from the social, and also terrorism. All these things you can play as reasons why devolution occurs. And then always good, maybe if you have it, to have an example to illustrate your point. Hey, we got one more thing. Irredentism is a political process that it refers to the movement to unite by people. I don't know if that's the right word there, so let me read it again. The movement to unite by people who share a language or other cultural elements but are divided by a national boundary. Okay, so like think of it this way. Your country lost a piece of land, whether by war and a treaty or whatever other reason there could be, and you are seeking to put them back together again. So the irredentism, well, the devolution happens for like if you gain that territory and now you're losing it. Does that make sense? Like you gain it from that other country, but now by whatever reason you're losing that to that other country. So again, you're not breaking up yourself, you're just losing that part as its authority goes to another country. And think about it as like putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Your country falls apart, now you want to put the pieces back together. So there's a lot of examples of that. Probably most notably recently, Russia invading the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, seizing that area. To kind of to give you the full context, the Crimean Peninsula had a lot of ethnic Russians there. There was a lot of support for that, although not certainly unanimous support, but lots of support nonetheless to return to be a part of Russia. Historically, another example is Hitler restoring the German Empire after the peace treaty of World War I had split so much of it. And in particular, he's looking to place a people, not at least at first, those who spoke German back in the German Empire. It's when he starts to conquer countries that are not ethnically German that people are like, whoa, hold on. Although many were doing that before anyway, because he wasn't supposed to, because Treaty of Versailles, but that's another story. So again, irredentism is a process that can fit in here for devolution. Again, it's the idea that you're putting Humpty Dumpty back together, putting your pieces back together, and the devolution happens to the other country because they are losing pieces of it. Okay, so 4.9 is really big, as you see. When we talk about sovereignty, we're talking about the ability of a country to decide its own fate, their own political power, their own ability to decide what to do with their own lives. So this section is all about looking at the challenges to that and what can get in the way of a country basically trying to stop these challenges. Okay, so if we look first at what's called the effects of devolution, one thing that can happen is what we have the creation of an autonomous region, which it's a place in a country that has their own local legislative bodies to govern a region. that is an ethnic minority. And they handle day-to-day governance, but they still give allegiance to the national state. And probably the best example of that in the United States is the Navajo Nation in the U.S. Somewhat of Washington, D.C., although that's, again, we don't think of D.C. as a state because it's not. But it is an autonomous region. There is a mayor of Washington, D.C., but a lot of things that they can do in D.C. has to go through Congress. So, but we're looking here at a place that basically has a lot of its own authority. So that's more or less an effective devolution, right? Is that these areas, because of some sort of difference, particularly the Navajo Nation, because of some sort of difference, they have powers that maybe areas around it do not have. Another effective devolution is an idea called subnationalism, where people have a primary allegiance to a traditional group or ethnicity instead of your nationality, instead of your country. An example that a good example is in Quebec, with the French Quebec nation that desires, many of them desire their own country. So, like, again, your nationalism is not to your country because they're still Canadian citizens, but their nationalism is for something that is smaller. That would be like, and we've seen this in U.S. history, to where, like, the states pre-Civil War are saying, hey, my allegiance is to state rather than country. Robert E. Lee famously was invited to lead the federal troops, the Union's troops for the Civil War, but declined because his state, Virginia, seceded. And he said, hey, that's, Virginia is my country and that's who I go with. So that's something that is common, and it's something that can lead to internal conflict historically and also presently. Another effective devolution we mentioned is balkanization, where a state will literally break into different states. Yugoslavia, a great example of that, because you have Yugoslavia as a collection of, I think, 6 or 7 republics, and those through the 90s and 2000s split into different countries because of the devolution that had occurred, the internal conflict that had occurred. So again, devolution can happen without a country breaking up. But if you balkanize, you can see that we can draw new lines on the map, and we can be sure the devolution has happened. And usually those lines are drawn based on ethno-linguistic lines, trying to make sure that you don't create different different states. All right, another thing can um, that can occur with the challenges to sovereignty is any sort of changes in technology, because that can change the way that people relate to one another and participate in the political process. So when we talk about in the 21st century, we're certainly discussing the internet, social media, certainly ease of air travel, and accessibility to that. This totally changes the way that we relate to one another. So for example, these concepts, so again, this is not like what new technologies are there. Now we're looking at how does it change the ability of a state to decide their own destiny. So an example of that is that you have the concept of globalization, where people now are sharing cultural traits across borders, where basically you have all of the basic, this kind of not melting pot per se, but the world culture beginning where people kind of share traits. So technology has promoted that and helped that. But technology has weakened globalization because it allows groups that are subnational to organize. So now instead of countries working together, countries have to deal with their own internal problems. So for example, Canada with French Quebec, the United Kingdom with the Scottish independence referendum. So there are groups inside of countries that really fight against globalization because they want to divide the political map even further than it already is. Even though a lot, globalists don't necessarily want to make one world country, but they do want to keep the national boundaries, the status quo, and work with other countries to solve problems. So it can kind of go both ways, to where globalization is promoted or it's kind of shunned. The changes in technology also supported democratization, which is the transition from autocratic to more representative forms of politics. This can happen. This doesn't necessarily always happen. Example, we had the Arab Spring 2011, when across the Middle East you have an overthrow of autocratic dictators. Some countries saw, to be fair, few, saw the installation of more democratic representative forms of governance, while others did not. So, for example, Egypt, which overthrew Hosni Mubarak, an autocratic dictator, basically switched him out for more of a military dictatorship. So it wasn't anything that was transformational. I think Tunisia saw a lot of democratic reforms. But we could also use the example of Syria, which saw that democratization has not happened, and Arab Spring led to the civil war that has happened in the better part of the decade. Now, government can also respond to limit the spread of information because of technology so that democratic rights are not encouraged and spread. Best example of that would definitely be China, in my opinion, as the Chinese government has outlawed many internet sites, has created their own social media to kind of mirror that and to protect government power against any sort of popular protest. It's also created a digital divide between countries with and countries without access to information. So here we see another way that MDCs and LDCs see a separation and a difference. And it also increases the space-time compression, meaning that distance decay is decreasing and the information can move across the space much faster. So that leads to, again, a challenge in a state's sovereignty. If the government relied on the suppression of information as a way to control its population, it's going to be harder to do that now because of so many new technologies that can spread information faster. All right, another big concept here. It's called supranationalism. What we have in this concept is basically a political, economic, cultural, military cooperation among national states to promote shared objectives by giving up political power to a higher authority. The idea is that you're trying to solve a problem that cannot be solved by just one country, and the goal is to link together to try to solve that problem or address that issue. And by doing so, you may give up elements of sovereignty or parts of your ways or parts of your abilities to solve problems. So these organizations form to either create military alliances, promote trade, or combat environmental problems, or all three, depending on what the organization is. Globally, the best example of this is the United Nations, founded in 1945 after the end of World War II. And the big goal, at least immediately, was that number 2 bullet there for overall goals, fostering diplomatic relationships between countries and to seek to peacefully diffuse conflict so that World War II and World War I would not happen again, and that before war began, the world would have some sort of diplomatic channel to be able to talk about their problems. Good example of this was the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1962, the United States and Soviet Union on the brink of war. The United Nations was used as a vehicle to be able to talk through the issue and try to shift public opinion toward a side to really tell the other side it'd be a bad thing if war happened because the world would be supporting the other side. So it also, the United Nations promotes civil and human rights globally. You have seen this through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It is a way for the world to kind of get its message straight in what it wants to try to accomplish. Now, here's the thing, though. Different countries will give different variances of importance to what the UN does and says. I would not say what the United States does is very much based on what the UN wants. But again, the UN is there to try to be a way to connect the world together to solve problems bigger than any one country can solve. The UN can also order peacekeeping forces into a country having civil war, but cannot do that unless it has the support of the Security Council, which is made up of 5 countries. And if one member of the Security Council objects, there is no action taken. So it has to be something that all 5 agree with, and those 5 countries there have not always been best friends. So it can be a difficult thing. There's a picture of the UN. It looks lovely. It is located in New York City. But I think, at least in my class, the best example of illustrating the pros and cons of supranationalism comes with the European Union. So throughout a modern world history, Europe has been predominantly the power broker of the world, certainly from the 16th century on. But after World War I and World War II, it was clear that if Europe was going to have any sort of role in the world, post-colonialism, post-imperialism, and post-getting their butt kicked throughout the world wars, they were going to have to work together. So European countries began to unite in supranational organizations in 1958, and they formally established what's called the European Union in 1992. 28 countries total, although I believe that number is now down to 27, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the EU's big goal is to promote development through economic cooperation. This is not a military alliance. It's not necessarily a defense organization like your NATOs of the world. Well, this is predominantly economic and cultural. So how do they do that? Well, first of all, free trade. There are no barriers to trade in EU countries, meaning that you can trade with another EU country without having the threat of tariffs. A tariff is a tax placed on a foreign good. So it's giving European industries the ability to market their products across the continent rather than being restricted to the nation they're in. They could always have done that on the continent, but before this, or in an alternative universe, there would be a tariff that they would have to be placed on their product, meaning that it would be more expensive than what market value would suggest. So no barriers to trade. And to help with that and facilitate that economic activity, there's a common currency. So most countries in the EU use the euro as a means of trade and a medium of exchange. Again, to try to encourage people to maybe go visit another country and they won't have to switch out money. And then as a part of that visiting, there is also open borders. So you can go between most EU states and not have to show your passport. It's analogous to us going to Alabama or to Florida. You don't have to stop at the state line. You just drive over it. And depending on the country that you go across, you may see very little evidence that you're going into a new country. It's kind of interesting to think about how that's structured. So again, this has helped the EU maintain a successful, or Europe rather, to economically prosper. The EU's GDP is greater than the United States collectively. Of course, if you break it down by country, it's not, but altogether, they are. However, there has been a lot of, throughout the 25 to 30 years of the EU, there's been a lot of protest against it. There are certain things that the EU will say that its member states must do, and that may be regarding any sort of issues, including climate change, immigration, any sort of mandate revolving around those. It can basically be in any of those areas. So, for example, you may have the EU might say, okay, member states, we want to cut our carbon emissions down by this percentage for this date. So those directives can basically um, threaten the ability of a country to decide its own policy. Control over borders. So if you, like in the EU, there's just so much you can do to chart who is coming in and out of your country, right? So for a lot of people, that might be an issue. But really the biggest thing here, I think, that a lot of people in Europe would argue is that there may be a sense of a loss of identity. What does it mean to be French when immigration is so common and encouraged? A lot of people want to protect those traditional cultural values, and they see mass immigration into their country as a threat to their culture, and kind of just keeping that idea. You see this criticism more along the lines of people who are older, but that is a reflection of them growing up in a world where this kind of mobility and migration was very, very rare. Those who are younger, who might be more willing to travel to different countries and or even work in different countries, certainly are not as worried about this. They see it more of a one European culture with many subsets rather than many different cultures that collectively make up Europe. So it is an issue. It is something that is a generational issue for many. And it's something that supranationalism does do, is it does chip away at your state sovereignty and perhaps threaten or threaten to change even. That may not even change, but it threatens to impact and change your national identity. Got several other supranationalist organizations here: NATO, ASEAN, the Arctic Council, and the African Union. I mean, I really don't know if you will have to get this in depth. I'd say as long as you can explain the purpose and activities of one supranational organization, maybe max two, you'll be good. So if you got the UN and EU down, I think you'll be good to go. But this gives you a little bit more depth about countries. I like the Arctic Council. I think that's kind of cool. We're involved with that. We as in the U.S., so not Georgia. So I think that's that could be somewhere you maybe just poke around a little bit and learn a little bit more about. So there we go. A couple other issues here before we move on to our last thing. We look at transnational corporations, which companies that conduct business on a global scale. They have dramatically weakened state sovereignty because now certainly a country might be more dependent on foreign companies. This is particularly true in LDCs. Jobs will move from countries to countries, and corporations are not directly influenced by just one country. So when we talk about a threat to sovereignty, certainly the idea that your economy is linked to other countries is something that can threaten that. Concept also of the economy of scale is the cost advantages of conducting economic activity on such a large scale. So if we look at a corporation that says, and we did this when we looked at industry, they're saying, okay, we can make a lot more money or keep more profit if we get cheaper labor in another country. So broadening your scale to become transnational rather than just national makes more money for you because you can save now on labor cost by paying your workers less in another country. So again, the threat maybe to sovereignty is, those jobs in your own country leave, and that creates an economic issue. So this is certainly something that also should be tracked. Last concept, we put it all together: the consequences of centrifugal and centripetal forces. So when we talk first of all about centripetal forces, we're looking at forces that bring people together and can create new states. That would be certainly if you have a variety of regions and bring them together somehow. So when we look at political identity, schools teaching students the historical accomplishments of the country. That's something, 4th of July, Declaration of Independence, Revolutionary War. We learn about all these things so that it creates a sense of national identity. Nationalism, the pride of one's country, the flag, the pledge, customs, rituals, things based like that. Economic development, certainly infrastructure brings us together. Free trade between areas of the country. Certainly if there were tariffs between states, that would not be good. And then cultural practices, which it can kind of be political as well. But you have common religious holidays. That's something that certainly Christian holidays have become a little bit more mainstream in the United States, and you can look at other cultural issues. Now, what are the consequences of these centripetal forces? So I'm going to read a couple of things so you just kind of jot these down here. We already mentioned like it could create new states. It could mean more equitable infrastructure development. So you have across the country, you have infrastructure that becomes, whether that be roads, bridges, internet, Wi-Fi use. All of these things become more even across the country because of the connectedness we feel. So if we're like, you know what, as a country, if we've been brought together, we got to make sure Idaho's got all the internet they need. So that could lead to that. Increased cultural cohesion. So we have, certainly our country is more connected together. Its culture is shared by more people. And then lastly, centrifugal forces, which are forces that tend to break apart states or keep ones from forming. You can read those there. We have talked a lot about those. I think the economic and cultural factors certainly play a huge role. If you think about like cultural factors, even it seems very bookish in the definition, but like even talking about like a religion or a language, like these things that get in the way of people uniting. So they can lead, centrifugal can lead to failed states, meaning that is a state that's failed. I mean, it's basically a state that's falling apart and breaking. Development being very uneven in the country. So you have areas that are developed and others that are not for various reasons. It could lead to stateless nations, which is a consequence of a failed state. And then also you could see ethnic nationalist movements inside of the country because of the lack of cultural cohesion. So all these things are not great, but honestly, they seem a bit more common in the world because it seems easier for us to define ourselves based on our differences rather than similarities. So that's it. That's all we got. This been a little longer than I thought, but hey, that's life. Again, this is Unit 4, closing it up, I think. Yes, that's the last slide. And then we got agriculture next. So we're going to knock that out next week. And then we got our AP test. We'll rock and roll after that. So we'll be good.